In January 1938, the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg received credible information that the Austrian National Socialists were planning a coup. Adolf Hitler had absolutely nothing to do with this, but at the end of the day, the only man who could possibly restrain them was him. Schuschnigg, quite understandably, asked to speak with Hitler personally at the Berghof. This fairly understandable act led to a series of events which neither Schuschnigg nor anyone else saw coming. When he turned up to the Berghof, he planned to play the victim, which indeed he was. Instead, Hitler immediately took the offensive and berated him for hours on end, demanding that he sign a new agreement which reduced Austrian independence. Seyss-Inquart, a man agreeable to both Germany and Austria, was to be Minister of the Interior, and Austria was to coordinate her economic and foreign policy with that of Germany's. Schuschnigg signed and then went back to Austria to get the document approved, which after much discussion went ahead. This wasn't the end, however. Schuschnigg simply could not accept the humiliation, and a tidal wave of resentment began to build up inside of him. Eventually, it came to the surface in the form of a decision that would change the fate of European history. For some strange reason, after the crisis had already concluded, Schuschnigg decided that now was the time to make a great act of defiance. He would stop this slow slide towards vassalage by simply staging a plebiscite in a few days' time before Hitler could react. The issue was firstly that he didn't even make plans for how this vote would be carried out, and secondly, the Austrian people overwhelmingly wanted to unite with Germany. It was just Schuschnigg and his government which was standing in the way. To make a long story short, this brash decision led to Hitler and Goering taking advantage of the crisis. Schuschnigg had no friends abroad, and the situation quickly got out of hand. Before long, he realised his mistake, but it was too late, and he resigned. Seyss-Inquart took his place, and in March 1938, Austria ceased to exist, after the German army moved in, where they were greeted by emotional cheers, flowers, and kisses. No one abroad really cared all that much. After all, it was a union that both sides wanted. The more important aspect of this whole crisis was that it showed that the borders of Europe were once again movable. It showed Hitler that he could gamble for his aims and get away with it. It showed the Germans in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Lithuania that there was a glimmer of hope for them returning to their homeland. It showed the Allies that Hitler was willing to expand. If there was to be a next target, it was obvious to all who it would be. Czechoslovakia was a united nation in name only. In fact, there was more Germans than Slovaks. Almost all 3 million of them wanted to return home. On the 28th of March, not even a month after the Anschluss, Hitler received the Sudeten German representative Konrad Henlein and gave him permission to agitate, although some historians dispute this and find the evidence to have no basis. Regardless, what we know for sure happened was that Heinlein's strategy was, quote, "We must always demand so much that we can never be satisfied," end quote. The goal was to wait for the Czechs to make a wrong move and provoke a crisis. It didn't take long for the crisis to arrive. Before we begin, a disclaimer. This video is both an independent video on the Czechoslovakian crisis and also an episode in my series on the life of Adolf Hitler. Both are rather controversial topics, but I urge you not to overthink it. This video is purely a work of history, and I will express no political opinions of my own whatsoever. I will just say what happened. All my sources will be linked in the description, and if you want anything more specific, then please do ask in the comments, and I'll be happy to provide it. Thank you. As always, you can easily watch this video on its own, but if you'd like to start the series from the start, then the link will be in the description, or on my channel homepage. And lastly, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members. YouTube is my full-time job, however my videos need to undergo a manual review for monetization, and as a result it is purely these kind donations and subscriptions that keep me afloat, and I cannot thank you all enough. So if you do enjoy these videos and you'd like to support the channel, join the Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or even our new Minecraft server, then please do consider signing up via one of the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps massively. Thank you. In 1919, the map of Eastern Europe was completely redrawn. The empires of Germany, Russia, and Austria gave way to a whole handful of new countries in the name of self-determination. Negotiating the borders of these new states was a nightmare. It took over a year to finalise all the peace conferences, and almost everyone was left disappointed, except the new nation of Czechoslovakia. Romania, the Czechs, and the Yugoslavs had all been promised Hungarian land before the Hungarian Treaty had even come up for discussion yet. Due to this, without the Allies even realising it, they ended up punishing Hungary far harder than any other nation. Rather understandably, the Hungarians were furious, and the issue of their countrymen being stuck inside of their neighbours' borders became the focus point of Hungarian politics for the next few decades. They would play a key role going forward. In Paris, the Czechs were the most well received of anyone, and managed to charm, lie, and manipulate their way into not only freeing themselves from centuries of Habsburg rule, but also into making a huge multinational state with them at the head. Margaret Macmillan describes the impression the Czech representatives gave in her book, Peacemakers. Quote, "Where the Poles tended to bring exasperated sighs, even from their supporters, the Czechs basked in general approval. The Poles were, of course, dashing and brave, but quite unreasonable. The Romanians, charming and clever, but sadly devious. The Yugoslavs, well, rather Balkan. The Czechs were refreshingly Western. Of all the people whom we saw in the course of our journey," reported an American relief mission that travelled throughout the former Austro-Hungarian Empire in January 1919, "the Czechs seemed to have the most ability and common sense, the best organisation, and the best leaders." End quote. Again from Macmillan, quote, "Almost everyone in Paris liked and admired the Czechs and their leaders. Lloyd George, who fought Beneš, the little French jackal, and the Czechs' claims excessive, was an exception. Beneš and Masaryk were unfailingly cooperative, reasonable and persuasive, as they stressed the Czechs' deep-seated democratic traditions and their aversion to militarism, oligarchy, high finance, indeed, all that the old Germany and Austria-Hungary had stood for." End quote. Patrick J. Buchanan, in Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, says, quote, "Masaryk and Beneš, who had demanded the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the principle of self-determination for Czechs, ran a state that was a living contradiction of the principle. For Czechs now ruled Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, Poles, and Ruthenians, who constituted half the population and had never been consulted about being ceded to Prague. Czechoslovakia was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, Catholic Protestant conglomerate that had never existed before." End quote. When all was said and done, the Czechs were only 47% of the population and had got essentially everything they wanted. The Paris Peace Conference was such a mess that all of this had essentially been achieved via trickery. When President Woodrow Wilson was asked why he had handed over 3 million Germans to Czech domination, he exclaimed, quote, "Why, Masaryk never told me that." End quote. The reason he was never told this was because fake maps and fake numbers had been used. Edvard Beneš, the Czech foreign minister, told the Allies that there was not over 3 million, but only around 1.5 million Sudeten Germans, and that, quote, "The Germans in Bohemia are only colonists." End quote. By contrast, Beneš claimed that there was 3 times as many Czechs there. If the Allies had shown even the slightest bit of care in fact-checking the maps they were given in Versailles, the Czechs would have been laughed out of the room. The Czechs were outnumbered 10 to 1, and in many cases 20 to 1 by Germans in most of the disputed regions. If these Germans were colonizers, they were the most effective colonizers of all time. The real reason for the Sudetenland to be included was not due to any real claims the Czechs had on the area, but due to the defensible mountainous terrain and the raw materials there. Beneš claimed that without the sugar refineries, glassworks, textile mills, smelters, and breweries in these lands, the state would simply not survive. The French, who wanted allies in Eastern Europe against Germany, were more than happy to oblige. Macmillan in Peacekeepers wrote, quote, "In Bohemia," commented an American expert cynically, "they demand their historic frontiers, regardless of the protests of large numbers of Germans who do not wish to be taken over in this way. In Slovakia, they insist on the rights of nationality and pay no heed to the ancient and well-marked historic frontiers of Hungary." End quote. Even before the exact borders were fixed by the treaty, the Czechs had marched into Hungary under the pretext of combating communism. When the Hungarians counterattacked, the Czechs immediately appealed to the Allies for help. They painted themselves as a peaceful nation who couldn't possibly understand why the aggressive Hungarians would attack them. Elsewhere, in the West, the Czechs were lined up on the German border, ready to invade with the Allies if the Germans refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. In the north, they were clashing with Poland over the coal-rich region of Teschen, where Poles outnumbered Czechs 2 to 1. Beneš explained to the Allies that these Poles were temporary inhabitants. They were simply drawn here by the higher standard of living, and now that they were so influenced by Czech culture and language, they were no longer Poles. In the end, shots were fired, and the two ended up clashing. Eventually, the Allies chose to split the region in two. The Czechs got the all-important coal mines, and the Poles were left resentful of their southern neighbour. The Czechs, within a year, had made enemies of almost all their neighbours. As for the interior, the Czechs made vague promises of autonomy for their national minorities to the Allies. Here, they would make no friends either. Even before the end of the peace conferences, the state was showing signs of the chaos to come. In early 1919, the Slovakians immediately got a taste of what life would be like under this strange new state. Slovakia was cut off from the Hungarian markets it had been attached to for centuries. There was no more Hungarian coal. The sugar beets rotted in the fields. The refineries closed down. There was riots all over the Slovakian lands. Farmers and factory workers were out of work. An American reporter said that in effect, the Slovakians were saying to their new Czech overlords, quote, "We thank you for nothing. You say you have rescued us from the political oppression of the Hungarians, which was in fact pretty bad, but now we are under martial law. We have no work, little food, we suffer from cold, and our future is bleak," end quote. The tension continued to ramp up, and the Czechs did nothing to help. As a result, when the Czech army marched into Hungary that summer, the Slovaks attacked them in the rear. Even the Slovakian delegates that were meant to arrive in Paris for the peace talks were prevented from leaving the country and had to take a detour through Yugoslavia, Italy, and Switzerland just to get there. Here, they asked Edward House, an American diplomat, to come with them to their leader at a monastery. This man was Andrej Hlinka, a Catholic priest and the most important man in Slovakian politics. He told House, quote, "We have lived alongside the Magyars for 1,000 years. All the Slovak rivers flow towards the Hungarian plain, and all our roads lead to Budapest, their great city, while from Prague we are separated by the barrier of the Carpathians," end quote. He went on to say that Slovaks were true Catholics, and the Czechs, whatever they said, were infidels. By the end of the conversation, he did not see much hope in undoing what had already been done, with the creation of this mongrel state. He said, quote, "God has punished me, but I shall continue to plead before God and man for my people who are innocent and without stain," end quote. Over the next decade, Hlinka would build up the Slovak Populist Party. He spent the rest of his life fighting for Slovakian independence, and only died months before it came to fruition under his successor, Father Tiso. As for the Sudeten Germans, their introduction to their new Czech leaders was going even worse. On the 16th of February 1919, the area was technically still part of Austria, and so the locals headed to the polls to vote in the first democratic election. The Czechs sent in the army and stopped the vote. On the 4th of March, the Germans arranged a peaceful protest in response. The Czechs replied by simply firing into the unarmed crowd. 54 Germans died. 20 of them were women. Just a few months later, Beneš would promise the Allies to, quote, "Give the Germans all the rights they are entitled to. It will all in all be a very liberal regime," end quote. As with all things Beneš, this was a lie. Almost immediately the Czechs transferred military garrisons, railroad personnel, civil servants, prison populations, and even hospital patients into the border regions in order to manipulate the census figures. In one instance, a 600-man army battalion spent a single day in a German town, and they were counted on the census. As a result of this trickery, the Germans had been scammed out of their rightful representation in parliament. On other occasions, the Czechs were less tricky and more straightforward. At an election rally for the Sudeten German Party in 1937, the speaker openly criticised Beneš. In response, the Czech police marched in and massacred the attendees. 53 Germans died and hundreds were injured. As soon as the state came into existence, German schools were closed and replaced with Czech ones, forcing the locals to attend. 9 of Bohemia's 19 German universities were closed. Only 4.7% of state financial assistance went to German college students, even though Germans were 22% of the population. All public forms and applications were in Czech only. Half the German municipal and rural officials lost their jobs. 41% of German postmen and 48.5% of railroad workers met the same fate. In April 1919, the Land Reform Act set about redistributing land from the Germans to the Czechs. The head of the program described how it worked. Quote, "The soil is passing from the hands of the foreigners into the hands of the Czech people," end quote. Many Germans had to return to their formerly owned lands as tenant farmers to get by. 1/3 of the Sudetenland was covered by forests. Here, the Czech state took over direct administration and immediately fired 40,000 German forestry workers, who were then swiftly replaced with Czechs. This pattern was repeated in most industries. In 1936, the British Foreign Office estimated that the Germans, who were 22% of the population, made up 60% of the unemployed. In May 1919, Beneš, the same man who said he would give Germans all the rights they were entitled to, said that the Czechs were, quote, mortal enemies of the Germans. Later that month, during the inauguration for President Masaryk, the local Czechs broke into a home for not displaying a Czech flag. Inside, they found a German widow and mother of 4 who was bedridden from illness. They then proceeded to drag her down the staircase feet first, letting her head bounce off the steps. She died of her injuries. In 1921, Czech troops were randomly deployed in German settlements with no warning. Then, 4 miles from the German border, German protesters met the arriving Czech military personnel in Graslitz. In response, the soldiers just opened fire on the crowd once more. 15 Germans died. Between 1923 and 1932, there was 8,972 legal proceedings conducted against dissident members of ethnic minorities under the Law to Protect the Republic. Many of these were just Germans visiting Czechoslovakia for sports competitions or for ethnic festivals. To put all this into perspective, 56% of the country was declared as a, quote, border zone. This border zone actually just meant the minority areas. 85% of Sudeten Germans lived here, all of the Poles, all of the Ruthenians, and 95% of the Hungarians. If you lived in the border zone, you lived under martial law. The army supervised the administration of factories, construction projects, public works, the telephone service, and forestry. The minority citizens only had limited civil liberties. To add insult to injury, Beneš described his country as a, quote, lighthouse of democracy. All these actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Whilst the French didn't care, Chamberlain, a good Christian, and a man who always wanted the best for Europe and just wanted to avoid war, did care. In April 1938, curiously, just before the crisis arose, the French Prime Minister appeared in London to ask Chamberlain to publicly guarantee Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain in response declared that the people of England would never begin a war to prevent the nationalities of Central Europe from expressing their will in a plebiscite. Even before the peace treaties were signed in Paris, France was thinking ahead to the future. Whilst America, and increasingly Britain, began to feel sorry for Germany, France never let up. The plan was to build up these new Eastern European states to encircle Germany. One of these nations was the huge Poland, but they were almost immediately out of control and invading all of their neighbours. Beneš and Masaryk in Czechoslovakia, however, were more than willing to play along with the French. After all, as Beneš said, the Germans were their mortal enemies. In January 1924, the French and the Czechs signed a friendship pact, which contained a military clause. The target was obvious. The following year, an official formal military treaty was signed. After Hitler came to power, this was ramped up further. The French attempted to strengthen their ties with the nations surrounding the Third Reich in a bid to snuff out any potential moves Hitler might make on his neighbours. Perhaps understandably, Hitler felt trapped and would often talk about this in speeches to justify his own rearmament, which was in fact much slower than that of France, Britain, or even the Czechs, who had one of the strongest armies in Europe. In December 1935, Beneš replaced the more moderate Masaryk as president, and he immediately stepped things up. Just months after coming to power, he concluded a full-blown military alliance with the Soviet Union. In early 1936, there was already 32 airfields built on the German frontier to accommodate the Red Air Force. Surrounding these airfields were huge complexes of depots to stockpile fuel and bombs. After the pact was signed, there was Red Army troops stationed in Bohemia and Moravia, undergoing parachute training in case of an invasion of Germany. Sir Orme Sargent of the British Foreign Office called Czechoslovakia a distribution centre for Stalin's Comintern propaganda against Germany. He wasn't wrong. Prague was the new home of hordes of communist exiles from Germany in 1933, and then from Austria in 1938 after the Anschluss. By 1936, France, the Czechs, and the Soviets all had military alliances with each other, and this was part of the reason Hitler marched into the Rhineland. Almost immediately as soon as this happened, Beneš showed his willingness to oppose Germany and offered France the support of the Czechoslovakian army to invade. Over the coming months, this army would be just shy of 1.5 million men. Hitler always wanted to return to the Sudeten Germans, but with this web of alliances surrounding him, he was pretty much kept in check. For 20 years, the Germans had to sit back and watch as their fellow Germans were mistreated just over their frontiers, not only in the Sudetenland but also in Poland and Lithuania. By 1938, however, Hitler felt bold enough to take chances and it was actually the Czechs he wanted to come to an arrangement with first, rather than the Austrians. The Anschluss just so happened to fall in his lap first. He absolutely resented the way the Czechs had behaved, and he hated Beneš in particular, who he pictured as one of the key men who wanted to crush Germany. Hitler was correct. Beneš was later proved to be caught up in all sorts of schemes with international finance and British politicians to bring down Hitler. On the 20th of February 1938, Hitler said during a speech to the Reichstag, quote, "It cannot be disputed that so long as Germany was herself weak and defenceless, she had to simply accept the continuous persecution of German people along our borders. The interests of the German Reich also include the protection of those fellow Germans who are unable on their own, on our own very frontier, to ensure their right to basic, human, political and ideological freedoms." End quote. Hitler had officially made the Sudeten German cause his own. By 1938, everyone sort of knew that a showdown between Hitler and Beneš was coming. Beneš had been like a yappy chihuahua barking at a puppy, only for that puppy to grow up to become a pit bull. Now, the tables were turned. Hitler could bark back. No one was sure how it would go down, only that it would. Early in the year, the British ambassador in Prague, Sir Basil Newton, said to the Foreign Office, quote, "How precisely they will proceed, it is impossible to prophesy, but the indications are that they will at first seek to achieve their aims by friendly diplomacy, rather than by physical or economic terrorism." End quote. On the 6th of May, the British newspaper magnate Lord Rothermere spoke on the topic in the Daily Mail, quote, "I myself cannot imagine for a moment that Great Britain would calmly look on for 20 years while 3.5 million Britons lived under the lash of a thoroughly abominable people who speak a foreign language and have a completely different world outlook." End quote. Hitler's actual strategy was mostly to sit and wait. He had plenty of patience. Eventually, he reasoned, the crisis would come to him, and he could bluff his way through it, just like he had in Austria. He kept his open involvement with the Sudeten Germans to a minimum, and together, they waited for the Czechs to put their foot wrong. Whilst Hitler often bluffed and was willing to gamble, Beneš wasn't. Beneš was all bark and no bite. The state of Czechoslovakia would most likely not survive a crisis in reality. If a single concession was made to one minority, the state would collapse. After all, the minorities outnumbered the Czechs. The actual Czech people themselves were a very small nation. It had taken 300 years to recover from the destruction of the Bohemian Revolt in 1620. Beneš was not willing to risk going toe-to-toe with Germany, unless it was a general war with extremely favourable odds. Perhaps the reason the Czechs were so oppressive to their minorities was because if they took their boot off their necks, the Czechs would be surrounded and finished. This precarious way of doing things couldn't last forever though. A crisis would have to come eventually, and at that point, Beneš would be at the mercy of the great powers. If they didn't honour their military agreements, the Czechs would be doomed. So in a sense, both Hitler and Beneš wanted a crisis to come. Beneš wanted a crisis in which the great powers would back him so he could destroy Hitler. Hitler wanted a crisis so he could bring the Germans and Sudetenland home. Suddenly, that crisis arrived, and it was Beneš, not Hitler, who initiated it. Patrick J. Buchanan described what happened next in his book Churchill, Hitler and the Unnecessary War. Quote, "The triggering event occurred 2 months after the Anschluss, while Hitler was still celebrating. Rumours began to fly of an imminent German invasion of Czechoslovakia. The rumours were false, and there is reason to believe the Czechs had planted them with the knowledge of Beneš, who ordered mobilization. As the rumours ricocheted around Europe, London warned Berlin that Britain would not sit still for an invasion. Paris and Moscow renewed their commitments to Prague. Hitler was suddenly in a major crisis, not at all of his own making. Confronted by a united Europe, Hitler was forced to renounce any intent to invade Czechoslovakia. German officers escorted British military advisors along the Czech border to prove there was no preparations for war. When no attack came, the Czechs bragged and brayed about how they had forced Hitler to back down, showing the world how to face down the bully. It was apparent to Hitler that Beneš had precipitated the crisis to humiliate Germany, wrote Tansil. To be falsely accused by Czech officials was to Hitler the supreme insult." End quote. Despite showing the British that the Czechs had lied, Hitler was still absolutely furious. He was gripped by a, quote, "burning rage to get even with Czechoslovakia, and particularly with President Beneš, who, he believed, had deliberately humiliated him." End quote. He called in his generals and ordered them to pull up Case Green, the plan for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Quote, "It is my unshakable will that Czechoslovakia shall be wiped off the map," end quote. And then rewrote the invasion plan of Case Green to read, "It is my unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future," end quote. 18 days later, he removed this sentence. Neville Henderson, the British ambassador to Germany, recalled, quote, "The defiant gesture of the Czechs in mobilizing some 170,000 troops and then proclaiming to the world that it was their action which had turned Hitler away from his purpose was regrettable. But what Hitler could not stomach was the exultation of the press. Every newspaper in America and Europe joined in the chorus. No had been said, and Hitler had been forced to yield. The democratic powers had brought the totalitarian states to heel, etc. It was above all this jubilation which gave Hitler the excuse for his worst brainstorm of the year, and pushed him definitely over the borderline from peaceful negotiations to the use of force. From May the 23rd to May the 28th, his fit of sulks and fury lasted, and on the latter date he gave orders for a gradual mobilization of the army, end quote. And so, Beneš, like Schuschnigg before him, took the gamble that would lead to the collapse of his own country. Beneš and Schuschnigg seemed to have a lot in common. Before their gambles, they hadn't read the room. In both cases, the men overestimated their friend's ability or willingness to help them. Chamberlain, the man who would make or break any kind of anti-German alliance, felt much the same way about Beneš's mongrel state than he did about Schuschnigg's Austria. In Austria's case, the Austrians wanted the Union, and Hitler's claims there made sense. He would not stand in the way. In the Czechs' case, Hitler had perhaps even more valid grievances, as the Germans were being horribly mistreated. Most of the Germans fit neatly into the border regions and could be separated from the Czech state without much bother. The only argument the Czechs had was that the region was defensible. Other than that, they had no reasonable claim to it. Besides the validity of the Czech cause, there was the other elephant in the room, the practical aspect. Czechoslovakia's geographic position made it near impossible to help. It jutted out directly into German territory. Before the crisis had even broken out, Chamberlain wrote to his sister, quote, "You only have to look at the map to see that nothing that France or we could do could possibly save Czechoslovakia from being overrun by the Germans if they wanted to do it. Therefore, we would not help Czechoslovakia. She would simply be a pretext for going to war with Germany. That we could not do, unless we had a reasonable prospect of being able to beat her to her knees in a reasonable time, and of that I see no sign. I therefore abandoned any idea of giving guarantees to Czechoslovakia or the French in connection with her obligations to that country," end quote. The French, for their part, remained tied to British foreign policy despite their public declarations stating otherwise. The lack of French independence in foreign policy then had a domino effect. Stalin refused to honour his obligations to the Czechs if the French did not. Even in terms of practicality, the Soviet position was difficult. Yes, they could help with their air force, but besides that, they had no means of getting actual ground forces to Czechoslovakia. They would have had to pass through Poland or Romania. The Poles detested the Soviets both as Russians and as communists, and the Romanians had their own issues with the Soviets at the border. There was zero chance of them being allowed to pass through. To make the situation worse, when Beneš had called the mobilization on the 20th of May, he didn't even consult his French allies. By the following day, Europe, thanks to the actions of a single man, was the closest it had come to war since the Great War. The Sudeten territories and the border forts were all manned, and the Czechs were ready for war. They just needed both Germany and their allies to take the bait. The French, this time, actually did. French Premier Daladier invited the German ambassador to his desk. On it was a mobilization order. Quote, "It depends upon you, Excellency, whether I sign this document or not," end quote. Back in Berlin, the British ambassador told Ribbentrop, quote, "France has definite obligations to Czechoslovakia, and that, if these had to be fulfilled, His Majesty's government would not guarantee that they would not be forced by events to become themselves involved," end quote. Ribbentrop was quite rightly absolutely furious at the British and French for taking the Czech bait, and began to rage with righteous indignation at Henderson, the British ambassador. If the Brits and French were crazy enough to possibly believe these rumours and go to war over them, he said, then, quote, "once again, we shall have to fight to the death," end quote. After this, Ribbentrop quickly took a special plane to meet Hitler at the Berghof. Here, he found a Hitler who was as angry as he himself was. Not a single military movement had taken place near the Czech border, and not a single division had been concentrated there. As the days passed, however, Hitler's plans of invasion went from fake rumours to actual reality. He was absolutely livid. He had always detested the foreign press, but this was a new level. They were whipping up a European war, purely based on an invented story by Beneš. On the 28th of May, Hitler called in his generals, and his mind was made up. He would crush Czechoslovakia, come what may. Even Goering was shocked, who was usually one of the more belligerent top men in the NSDAP. He said to Captain Wiedemann, Hitler's adjutant, quote, "Doesn't the Führer realise what he is doing? This will mean war with France," end quote. Nothing would change his mind, it seemed. Quote, "It is my unshakable will to wipe Czechoslovakia off the map. We shall have to use methods which, perhaps, will not find the immediate approval of the old officers," end quote. By the end of the session, Goering had been won over, as everyone always tended to when Hitler had made his mind up about something. Quote, "Mein Führer, let me congratulate you wholeheartedly on your unique concept," end quote. He told the army to prepare and gave them until the 1st of October to do so. In the West, Fritz Todt, the man who had built the Autobahn, was asked to speed up production on the West Wall to stop the French. Within weeks, over 500,000 men were working on fortifications on the French border. The plan was to use as few troops as possible to hold off the French, whilst the main force in the east obliterated the Czechs with a lightning strike. With all this being said, the Führer would obviously have preferred, at all costs, to not go to war with the Allies, but if it came to it, if he could not make them see sense, he would be ready. So, Beneš's trick had actually worked. Hitler would be baited into attacking the Czechs. The French had been taken in by it, as had the English. He just needed the crisis to continue down these very narrow tracks, which were in his favour. If it went another direction, however, Beneš could be ruined, and his country with it. It was all or nothing. To all of this, there was a strange element. In the city of London, there was a group called The Focus, which was hell-bent on getting into war with Germany at any monetary or human cost. One of the key figures of the organisation was a man named Sir Henry Strakosch, a wealthy financier born in Austria who had moved to England and made his fortune in the banking and gold industry, specifically in South Africa. Strakosch, along with others, detested Hitler on a personal level. They would do anything to destroy his regime, or even Germany as a concept. On their payroll was all sorts of people. The most prominent among them, however, was Winston Churchill, who received a huge payment to get him out of his crippling financial situation in 1938, around the same time as the crisis. In return, he was tasked with bringing Britain into a general war with the Germans. In 1940, when he actually came to power, he was paid a fortune not to surrender, and to keep the war going, which he duly did against the wishes of his country. He didn't care, he was getting rich. Another on payroll included Duff Cooper, First Lord of the Admiralty, who actually resigned after the crisis, as his efforts to provoke a war failed. When war did break out, he went to the USA, where he was paid to whip up public opinion against the Germans on a vast speaking tour. One of the key components of making this group work was the press. The British press was completely infiltrated, and they were either directly owned by those whipping to whip up a war, or they were able to be brought off fairly easily. Here is where the focus becomes relevant to the current situation. Before the crisis was over, payments were made directly from the Czech embassy to the Focus. A single payment alone in July was of $2 million. Goering's wiretap agency actually ended up picking up on this, and Hitler quickly had the evidence collected and then given to the British ambassador, with strict instructions to show it to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who Hitler quite rightly believed to be an honest man, just trying to do the right thing. Hitler didn't want the Brits starting a European war just because of a small group of schemers on payroll. Chamberlain would talk about Churchill and his schemes to overthrow him in his diary later on, but there wasn't much he could do. He was absolutely surrounded by those being paid to undermine his appeasement policy. Even his own foreign minister in the past, Anthony Eden, was one of those almost certainly on payroll, as he too was one of the biggest agitators by far. Chamberlain, however, despite all the roadblocks, had to do his best to navigate the Brits through this crisis. With all that being said, where a lot of the rumours regarding Germans attacking came from, it needs no explanation where they could have come from. By now, the situation was spinning out of control, and Hitler tried to calm things down so he could steer things to his advantage. The Germans in the Sudetenland were being brutalised, and Europe seemed to be on the brink of war. He said publicly, quote, "What the Germans insist on is the right to self-determination that every other nation also possesses, and not just words. This isn't supposed to be a gift for these Sudeten Germans from Mr. Benez. They have the right to demand a life of their own, just like every other people. I demand that the oppression of the 3.5 million Germans in Czechoslovakia stop, and that in its place, the free right to self-determination step in." End quote. The crisis was going on too long, and unluckily for Benez, the Brits began to stop and think. British Ambassador Henderson said, quote, "On the broadest moral grounds, it was thus difficult to justify offhand the refusal of the right to self-determination to the 2,750,000 Sudetens living in solid blocks just across Germany's border. Its flat denial would have been contrary to a principle on which the British Empire itself was founded, and would consequently never have rallied to us the wholehearted support either of the British people or of the Empire." End quote. Alexander Cadogan, Permanent Undersecretary for the Foreign Office, said that the Sudeten issue was, quote, "not an issue on which we should be on very strong ground for plunging Europe into war." End quote. In fact, Chamberlain himself was trying to push things back in Hitler's direction in order to save Europe from a catastrophe. Fritz Hess was told by Chamberlain's personal advisor to tell Hitler that Chamberlain himself had planted a favourable solution in the London Times. In this editorial, it suggested that autonomy should be given to the Sudeten Germans and actually enforced this time, unlike Benez's broken promises from before. Chamberlain was just trying to do the right thing, but when Ribbentrop got this message, he went berserk. Quote, "Autonomy? There can be no question of autonomy any longer." End quote. Before going on to remind Hess of the Czech mobilization and Benez's former actions. Hess rebutted that it sounded like it would be possible that Chamberlain could arrange the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany without war, but he needed it done peacefully, much like he had allowed Germany to take Austria. When Hitler heard these reports, he simply could not believe that the Czechs would ever surrender their military bastion. Quote, "I simply don't believe it. They can't be that stupid." End quote. Whilst Hitler's position continued to grow with the passage of time, so did the tension. Within his own army, there was talk of overthrowing him. Beck sent a memorandum to Brauchitsch, stating that attacking the Czechs would result in another world war. Quote, "The outcome of such a war would be a general catastrophe for Germany, not only a military defeat." End quote. He said that neither the army nor the German people were prepared for a war, and neither did they want one. Then they began to speak of a coup if Hitler did indeed move in. Was the Sudetenland worth risking the existence of the nation, they reasoned? First, the generals tried to confront Hitler alone, which didn't work. They were berated. Then, they were summoned as a group. Here, Hitler tried to make them see his side of things, which they did not. He told them that he couldn't see a wider European war happening with Daladier and Chamberlain in power. He was certain he would have to, and in fact, wanted to, smash Czechoslovakia with military action. Elsewhere in Europe, conflicting information was everywhere. It began to resemble the July crisis of the Great War. Everyone feared the worst. In England, Chamberlain received Germans claiming to know Hitler's plans. He was given dates and names of those who wished to oppose Hitler. On the other hand, Henderson, the ambassador in Berlin, said that the main danger of war came not from Hitler himself, but from Czech and German extremists, communists, and other influences, including the hatred abroad of Nazism. He said that Chamberlain should not, quote, "drive Herr Hitler into a situation where, his prestige being at stake, he would feel himself obliged to yield to his extremists." End quote. At home, Beck continued to moan to Hitler about the plans, and in the end, he resigned. Hitler accepted this resignation, but told him to keep it quiet, which he did, although in private, he continued to support the anti-Hitler coup. This group was planning the arrest of Hitler as soon as he gave the order to execute Case Green. Those involved were General von Witzelben, Admiral Canaris, Kurt von Hammerstein-Equord, and Franz Halder. On the civilian side, men such as Hjalmar Schacht were involved. Hitler got a pretty consistent message on his end, however. Everyone was cautioning him against war. Hess warned him privately that it was almost certain, so he had heard, that the French and Brits would join in to defend the Czechs. Hess urged patience. Time was on Germany's side. Economic progress and rearmament were going well. Given enough time, they would be unstoppable, he said. Most of all, he believed that the, quote, "Jewish propaganda would lose its effectiveness in Western nations over time, which would remove any desire to intervene in German affairs." Hitler didn't really buy any of this, however. As time passed and that year's Nuremberg rally was approaching, the world held its breath. Many thought that now would be the time that the Fuhrer would announce his plans to invade. Ambassador Henderson wrote home, quote, "The anxiety is no less great in Germany than elsewhere, and dictators can and must speak more clearly than the leaders of a democracy," end quote. Those that were worrying need not have bothered, however. This year's rally was called the First Party Rally of Greater Germany, and the occasion was centred around previous events in Austria, not the events to come. Hitler had brought the imperial crown, the orb of empire, the sceptre, and the imperial sword of the Holy Roman Empire from Vienna. He declared that they would remain in Nuremberg forevermore. At no point during the rally so far was the current crisis mentioned. All that remained was the final ceremony on the 12th. Meanwhile, in the background and in the coming weeks, Hitler and his generals would spend hours staring at maps, wondering how best to smash the Czechs. On this matter, they didn't have much luck. The Czech fortifications were akin to that of the Maginot Line in France, and no matter what ideas came to mind, all of them seemed to resemble a new Verdun. There appeared to be no way through without a total bloodbath. Perhaps the generals weren't actually trying to find a solution. After all, they were trying to put Hitler off. Keitel and Jodl found their cowardice disgusting. Jodl wrote in his diary, quote, "There is only one undisciplined element in the army, the generals. And in the last analysis, this comes from the fact that they are arrogant. They have neither confidence nor discipline because they cannot recognize the Führer's genius," end quote. He then continued on and said that they looked upon Hitler as the little corporal from the Great War, quote, "instead of the greatest statesman since Bismarck," end quote. Meanwhile in England, Chamberlain was still trying to defuse the situation and come to an understanding. He said to a group of journalists on the 11th of September, quote, "Herr Hitler has repeatedly expressed his own desire for peace, and it would be a mistake to assume that those declarations were insincere," end quote. The following day was the 12th, the day everyone had been waiting for, the Nuremberg rally finale. Hitler arrived at the stadium at 7 p.m. to the roars of the crowd. He then slowly walked towards the podium, whilst an unrelenting Sieg Heil roared in the background from his people. He began not with the Czech crisis, but with the party's struggles. Many began to think that he would just simply not mention it at all. But then, suddenly, the topic of the Czechs came up. Quote, "I am in no way willing that here in the heart of Germany, a second Palestine should be permitted to arise. The poor Arabs are defenceless and deserted. The Germans in Czechoslovakia are neither defenceless nor are they deserted, and people should take notice of that fact," end quote. This line wasn't followed up with a threat like the warmongers abroad wanted, however, but with a demand for justice for the mistreated Germans. He then said, quote, "We should be sorry if this were to disturb or damage our relations with other European states, but the blame does not lie with us," end quote. The world breathed a sigh of relief. One man was listening in Italy. When he heard these words, he turned away from his radio and said, quote, "I had expected a more threatening speech. Nothing is lost," end quote. This man was Mussolini. The most important recipients of Hitler's speech, however, were the Sudeten Germans themselves. To them, the truth behind Hitler's words were loud and clear. They would not be abandoned. Now was the time. For them, it was freedom or death, and they must act quickly. By morning, swastika flags covered every Sudeten town as far as the eye could see. Tens of thousands of Sudeten Germans were swarming the streets shouting, "We want self-determination." Almost immediately, the Czechs responded in their usual fashion. They began firing live rounds at the crowd. Almost as soon as the protests had begun, a civilian was dead, and dozens more were laying on the ground heavily wounded. Before the end of the day, the death toll had risen to 21, with hundreds more wounded. The Czechs, too, knew that this was now or never. If the Sudetens rose up and broke off, or if it was even taken to a plebiscite, they knew it was the end of the Czech state. If the Sudetens went, the Hungarians would want to go too. If the Hungarians went, the Slovaks would want to go too. If the Slovaks went, the Poles would want to go too. And if the Poles went, the Ruthenians would want to go too. The result would be a sorry little state with no means of protecting itself, or even functioning. Beneš had put his nation in an unwinnable situation. If they did nothing, they would lose everything. If they did put down the protests, they would lose everything and be detested. They chose to be detested. Henlein, the Sudeten German leader, took his chance and made a general call for freedom. As the situation got worse, more and more Sudetens began to rise up. The crisis was here. Almost the entire Sudeten German population went on strike and refused to pay taxes. Martial law was declared, and Germans began to be massacred all over the border regions. Henlein quickly lost control of the situation and appealed for Hitler to send the army in to, quote, put an end to any more murders resulting from Czech fanaticism, end quote. Paris and London began to panic, realising that the horse they had backed was going mask off and simply massacring minorities. Daladier, the French premier, continued on this path and warned Chamberlain that no matter what, he would back the Czechs. He claimed that the Czech state was vital to the future war with Germany. Quote, "In any military operation, there are wonderful possibilities for attacking Germany from Czechoslovak territory," end quote. Meanwhile, French aviation minister Pierre Cot said, quote, "From this state, the German economy and the German industry can most easily be destroyed with bombs. Joint attacks of the French and Czech air forces can very quickly destroy all German production facilities," end quote. Chamberlain, on the other hand, was not thinking of future war, but future peace. He had previously proposed visiting Germany, much to Daladier's annoyance, but now he would wait for the French no more. He immediately proposed a meeting with Hitler to personally fix this whole mess. Chamberlain was putting his foot down and taking charge. The French would have to take a back seat. When Hitler received the personal telegram from Chamberlain, he was absolutely beaming with joy and completely taken by surprise. His first reaction was, quote, "I fell from heaven." He immediately fired off a reply, enthusiastically accepting Chamberlain's offer to meet the next afternoon at the Burghof. Hitler's dream was coming true. He could finally make arrangements with the British, man to man, in good faith. In England, the population was absolutely overjoyed by the news that their Prime Minister was taking such a step in their benefit to bring about peace. Crowds rushed to the streets to wish Chamberlain well, with tears in their eyes, praying that their sons wouldn't be sent off to fight another pointless war. Meanwhile in Prague, the Czechs lamented their situation that their own leader had thrust them into. The newsboys in Prague shouted, "Extra! Read how the mighty head of the British Empire goes begging to Hitler." Meanwhile, crowds rushed to the streets to support President Beneš. They urged him not to back down, come what may. Beneš had quite the same idea. The Germans intercepted communications between Prague and its British and French embassies, both of which were wrapped up with Churchill's The Focus group. The central Czech government sent out communications stating that they must all stall for time to give Beneš's shadowy associates time to topple the Chamberlain and Daladier governments so they could install the, quote, war parties, aka the warmongers like Churchill. In Rome, Mussolini remarked, quote, "There will be no war, but this is the liquidation of British prestige." If British prestige meant saving the lives of millions of Europeans in a war, and the Sudeten Germans themselves from a genocide, then perhaps it was a price worth paying. Early on the morning of the 15th of September, Chamberlain left 10 Downing Street and set off on his journey to Croydon through the crowds of cheering Brits to reach his plane. Here he spoke into a BBC microphone, quote, "My policy has always been to ensure peace. The prompt acceptance of my suggestion encourages me to hope that my visit today will not be without results," end quote. At 8 a.m, Chamberlain set off in an aeroplane for the first time in his life. On the way, he felt a mixture of giddy excitement and crippling unease. The fate of Europe was in his hands. Chamberlain was a shy man who, when left to his own devices, usually came to the right decision. He was a devout Unitarian that genuinely wanted peace, and now he was setting off with no outside influences to distract him from his course. He was sure that he would get what he wanted, and that he held strong cards. At 12:30, he touched down in Munich and was greeted by Ambassador Henderson. He then proceeded through the thousands of Germans greeting him with salutes and shouts of Heil. By 4:30, Chamberlain and his party reached the Burghof, where Hitler was waiting at the top of the stairs for them. Here, they then had a cup of tea and talked before the two of them headed upstairs with Schmidt, Hitler's interpreter, to get down to business. Hitler began to list off grievances with his neighbours, and ran Chamberlain through the events that had led to the current situation. Chamberlain listened attentively, and answered any questions the Führer had with a friendly smile. He then looked Hitler in the face, and said that he was prepared to right any wrongs against the Germans, so long as force was not used. At this, Hitler exploded, and resorted to his usual tactics. When talking to Schuschnigg earlier in the year, he had feigned aggression in order to extract demands. Now he was going to try the same thing. It was as if Hitler was so used to double-dealing statesmen with an agenda, that now when he was faced with an honest man, he didn't realise it, and assumed Chamberlain was playing a game. Hitler responded angrily that it was not he that wanted to use force, but Beneš. Was it not the Czechs who were currently massacring Germans in the Sudetenland? Eventually, he worked himself up into such an angry torrent that Chamberlain had to ask him to slow down. The translator could only translate so fast. At this, Hitler exploded and said, "I shall not put up with this any longer. I shall settle the question in one way or another. I shall take matters into my own hands," end quote. At first, Chamberlain was taken aback, and he was resolved to make something of this meeting, and held his ground. Quote, "If I have understood you right, "You are determined to proceed against Czechoslovakia? If that is so, why did you let me come to Berchtesgaden?" He then made his own bluff and threatened to go home. He said that under the circumstances, it was best to just go home and that the whole thing had been a waste of time. Immediately, Hitler stopped. He didn't expect this counterattack. He then calmed down and spoke carefully, quote, "If, in considering the Sudeten question, you're prepared to recognise the principle of the right of peoples to self-determination, then we can continue the discussion in order to see how the principle can be applied in practice," end quote. After some more discussion, common ground began to be found, and Chamberlain said, quote, "I therefore suggest that we break off our conversation at this point, and that I return to England immediately for consultation, and then meet you again," end quote. Schmidt said that the Führer's face showed visible relief as he translated the words about meeting again. Hitler, for his part, agreed that he would take no drastic actions in the meantime, unless a, quote, "particularly atrocious incident occurred," end quote. And on that note, their 3-hour talk came to an end. The two then walked downstairs, still happily talking as they went. Hitler asked Chamberlain to join him to view the sights around the Berghof, but Chamberlain was fixated on his mission. He declined as, quote, "lives were being lost," in reference to the Sudeten Germans. He wrote to his sister, quote, "I had established a certain confidence, which was my aim, and on my side, in spite of the hardness and ruthlessness I thought I saw in his face, I got the impression that here was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word," end quote. When he returned home, he was once more met with huge crowds and applause. Meanwhile, in the US, President Roosevelt was absolutely livid. He raged against the PM's policy of peace at any price. He saw it as simply postponing an inevitable conflict, a conflict he wanted in order to realign the world to his and those behind him's principles. He even compared Chamberlain to Judas, a comment that Chamberlain, a devout Christian, would have found sickening coming from Roosevelt, who as a Freemason hated Christianity. At home, Chamberlain too faced opposition, not from his people, who were almost completely united in his favour, but from Parliament. Men such as Churchill, Eden and Cooper were agitating as hard as they could to get Chamberlain out of the way, or to push him towards war. They knew this was their big chance, but Chamberlain was absolutely fixed on his goal. On the 18th of September, Chamberlain met with the French delegation headed by Daladier. Here he told them straight that Czechoslovakia must be willing to cede territory to Germany. Daladier, by this point, was beginning to tire of the whole ordeal. Perhaps the blood of the Sudeten Germans had made him reconsider. Regardless, he finally ended up agreeing with Chamberlain, and said that a little, quote, "friendly pressure must be used to persuade the Czechs to cede, quote, some portions of Sudeten territory, but added that there must be some form of genuine guarantee for the remainder of the Czechoslovak state afterwards. Chamberlain wasn't so sure about this, but after some hesitation, he finally agreed to keep the French on side. Afterwards, Chamberlain as usual wrote to his sister, quote, "I have still many anxious days before me, but the most gnawing anxiety is gone, for I feel that I have nothing to reproach myself with, and that on the contrary, up to now, things are going the way I want," end quote. The next day, it was time to inform Beneš of the news that he would have to give up some territory, or lose all support. When confronted with this information, Beneš's whole world seemed to crash down before his eyes. He was so agitated, in fact, that at first he refused to discuss the matter. To add insult to injury, the British ambassador then told him that a response must be forthcoming, as Chamberlain wanted to talk to Hitler again in 48 hours. It was becoming clear that his bluff had failed, but the cornered Beneš scurried away to seek help from other quarters, whilst he left Chamberlain anxiously awaiting a reply. The following day, he summoned the Soviet minister and asked firstly if the USSR would fulfill their treaty obligations if France did likewise, and then secondly, he asked that if France refused, would the USSR support the Czechs in the League of Nations? By 7 p.m, he received a positive response to both of these questions directly from Moscow. 45 minutes later, the Czech foreign minister was telling his government to reject the British proposals and to try their luck with the French and the Soviets. The French ambassador was quickly summoned, and Hodzer, the Czech foreign minister, begged him to get a telegram from Paris stating that France would back out of the British agreement if it came to fighting. He said, quote, "It was the only way of saving peace," end quote, and then assured the French ambassador that Beneš fully consented to all of this, which was a lie. The French ambassador sent this message back home, but Newton, the British ambassador, sent a different message home. In this, he urged Halifax to send Beneš a final ultimatum, to accept the proposal, quote, "without reserve and without further delay, failing which His Majesty's government will take no further interest in the fate of the country," end quote. The Brits were officially washing their hands of Beneš. Halifax rushed to 10 Downing Street upon receiving this message. By midnight, he was back at the Foreign Office sending back instructions to Newton to urge the Czechs to consider, as if not, Chamberlain would have to postpone or cancel his second meeting with Hitler, aka he would leave Hitler to smash the Czechs. At 2 AM on the 20th of September, Newton arrived with the French ambassador at Hradčin Castle to see President Beneš. Upon hearing Lacroix's first words, he literally collapsed, quote, as if he had hit him with a club, end quote, and then proceeded to burst into tears, shaking profusely. After a period of silence, the Czech foreign minister spoke up and said that they would accept Chamberlain's proposal later in the day. For the rest of the day, however, Beneš desperately tried to find a way out, but to no avail. Late that afternoon, the Frenchman and the Brit were invited back to the Foreign Ministry. Here, they were handed a note stating that the Czechs sadly accepted the proposal. That evening, the Beneš government made a public announcement, quote, we relied upon the help that our friends might have given us, but when the question of reducing us by force arose, it became evident that the European crisis was taking on too serious a character. Our friends therefore advised us to buy freedom and peace by our sacrifice, and this in proportion to their own inability to help us. The President of the Republic and our government had no other choice, for we found ourselves alone, end quote. The next morning, Chamberlain said to a news reporter, quote, a perfect solution of the Czechoslovakian problem is an essential preliminary to a better understanding between the British and German peoples, and that, in turn, is the indisputable foundation of European peace. European peace is what I'm aiming at, and I hope this journey may open the way to it, end quote. This time, the meeting was at Bad Godesberg on the Rhine River. His plane landed at Cologne, and he was greeted with a guard of honour whilst an SS band played God Save the King. The first meeting took place at 5 PM later that same day at the Driessen Hotel on the west bank of the river. Chamberlain listed off the concessions that he and the French had gotten out of the Czechs in the previous few days, and then finally mentioned the guarantee that the British and the French had given the Czechs of what would be left of the state afterwards. He then leaned back in his chair as if he was proud of his work over the previous 5 days. Then, to Chamberlain's complete surprise, Hitler said regretfully, quote, I am exceedingly sorry, Mr. Chamberlain, but I can no longer discuss these matters. This solution, after the developments of the last few days, is no longer practicable, end quote. Chamberlain bolted up in his chair and looked furious. He simply didn't understand, he said. This was the exact solution that Hitler had wanted a few days ago. What could possibly have changed? Hitler replied that to make a non-aggression pact with the Czechs, which was part of Chamberlain's deal, was impossible until the claims of Poland and Hungary had been satisfied with the Czechs too. Hitler then proceeded to critique the British proposal point by point, and stated that the Sudetenland should be occupied by German forces immediately to prevent any more bloodshed. Chamberlain replied that he was disappointed. He had just risked his political career to give Hitler everything he wanted, yet here he was, demanding more. Then, Chamberlain was handed a note by one of his men, telling him that German troops had just crossed over the Czech frontier at Dagger to prevent a massacre of Sudeten Germans. Chamberlain replied that such incidents were bound to happen, and urged Hitler to do, quote, all that was humanly possible to settle matters in an orderly, peaceful way, and not to allow the work for peace to be disturbed by shootings and incidents, end quote. He then asked Hitler what proposal he had to work towards this goal. Hitler replied once more that the Sudetenland must be immediately occupied by German troops. A long debate then followed, during which Hitler was handed a note telling him that 12 German hostages had just been murdered by the Czechs. This caused Hitler to fly into a rage, in which he ended, quote, if Prague fell under Bolshevik influence, or if hostages continued to be shot, he would intervene militarily at once. After 3 hours, the first conversation was over and had accomplished nothing. However, they agreed to meet the next day. Chamberlain left disappointed and rather angry. Given all his hard work, this was rather understandable. On the flip side, however, Hitler was obviously acting emotionally, given the steady stream of reports he was receiving of his people being massacred across the border. Time was of the essence. The idea that Hitler wasn't completely himself at this time is stated by others around him. Wiedemann, Hitler's adjutant, stated that Hitler would often go into half-an-hour-long fits of rage during this time, as he was so upset at what was happening to the Sudeten Germans, but that in the end, quote, all I can say is that they were no different from the displays of others with a hot temper and little self-control, end quote. A back and forth of letters via messages between the two hotels then took place between Hitler and Chamberlain. Eventually, Chamberlain put his foot down and threatened to leave again if Hitler didn't start being more reasonable. This demand caused the second meeting to take place earlier rather than later. At 10 PM, the two were talking at the Driessen Hotel again, with Ribbentrop and Henderson. Hitler said that all Czech armed forces must withdraw from an area shown on a map that he then put on the table. Evacuation should start on the 26th, and the territory should be given to Germany on the 28th. Chamberlain then shouted, "But that's an ultimatum," and raised his hands in protest. The tone of the document alone made it unacceptable to send to the Czechs, he said, and that among neutrals it would be a diplomatic nightmare. All the other Brits in attendance then began to critique the timing, as opposed to the demands themselves, as ridiculous. Their biggest worry was that it would lead potentially to a European war. During the argument, an adjutant walked in and handed Hitler a message. Schmidt then read it out in English, quote, "Beneš has just announced over the wireless a general mobilization of the Czechoslovak armed forces," end quote. This amounted to 1.2 million reservists being called up. Hitler then broke the silence and promised Chamberlain, quote, "I shall of course keep my promise not to proceed against Czechoslovakia during the course of negotiations, at any rate, Mr. Chamberlain, so long as you remain on German soil," end quote. He then remarked that this Czech move settled the whole affair. How many more Sudeten Germans had to die? Chamberlain replied that the mobilization could be a precaution and that Beneš would not go back on his promise to respect Sudeten German self-determination. Beneš, of course, had broken this promise many times over the past 2 decades. After a brief argument, Hitler quoted an old German proverb, quote, "An end, even with terror, is better than terror without end," end quote. Chamberlain then said that there was no more reason for him to stay, and that, quote, he would go home with a heavy heart, since he saw the final wreck of all his hopes for the peace of Europe, but his conscience was clear. He had done everything possible for peace. Unfortunately, he had not found an echo in Herr Hitler, end quote. Hitler replied, quote, "To please you, Mr. Chamberlain, I will make a concession over the matter of the timetable. You're one of the few men for whom I've ever done such a thing. I will agree to October the 1st as a date for evacuation," end quote. The two then worked tirelessly to clean up Hitler's demands to the Czechs, and eventually, by 1:30 in the morning, they were done. Hitler personally thanked Chamberlain for his hard work towards peace. Chamberlain then left with a friendly Auf Wiedersehen, and according to those around him, they could not, quote, "discern the slightest strain of displeasure on his face," end quote. The PM then headed back to his hotel for a much-needed few hours of sleep. After this, he flew home. Whilst flying over the Thames, he imagined a German bomber taking the same route. Quote, "I asked myself what degree of protection we could afford to the thousands of homes which I saw stretched out below me, and I felt that we were in no position to justify waging a war today in order to prevent a war hereafter," end quote. When he got back, there was gigantic opposition from the paid shills in Parliament. Duff Cooper especially went berserk, and as those paying him demanded, said there should be an immediate British mobilisation. Chamberlain urged everyone to relax. Meanwhile in France, the French had already ordered a partial mobilisation. After a day of dealing with a split cabinet, he was then subjected to a meeting with Jan Masaryk, the Czech ambassador. His government was amazed at the contents of the Hitler demands. He said that it was an ultimatum that would remove the Czechoslovakian state of the means to defend its national existence. Quote, "Against these new and cruel demands, my government feels bound to make their utmost resistance, and we shall do so, God helping," end quote. It seemed as if everyone on Chamberlain's side was turning against him, when that evening the French delegation turned up in London to discuss the latest happenings. Daladier declared that France wouldn't recognise Germany's right to seize the Sudetenland. Chamberlain then asked if France would declare war if Hitler simply imposed on Czechoslovakia a frontier based on strategic considerations. Daladier gave an evasive answer, and when pressed said that France might try a land offensive after a period of concentration. The meeting was then cut short for half an hour, so Chamberlain could talk to his cabinet. Quote, "I am unwilling to leave unexplored any possible chance of avoiding war. Therefore, I suggest that, basing myself on the personal conversations I have had with Herr Hitler, I should write him a personal letter," end quote. The letter contained a last appeal suggesting a joint commission to determine how to put into effect the proposals already accepted by the Czechs. Quote, "If the letter fails to secure any response from Herr Hitler, Sir Horace Wilson should be authorised to give a personal message from me to the effect that if this appeal was refused, France would go to war, and if that happened, it seemed certain that we should be drawn in," end quote. The following morning, the 26th of September, Sir Horace Wilson was personally sent to deliver the letter. When Schmidt began to read it out to Hitler, the Führer began to lose it. "It is no use talking anymore," he exclaimed, and when Schmidt got to the part of the letter stating, "The Czechoslovakian government regard as wholly unacceptable the proposal," Hitler got to his feet and headed for the door. When he got to the door, however, he changed his mind and sat back down. His emotions were once again getting the better of him. He didn't calm down, however. He shouted out that the Germans were being treated like Negroes. "One wouldn't even treat the Turks like that," he said, before proceeding to rally against the Czechs. He did calm down, however, and accepted that he would have to negotiate with the Czechs. He said that they must accept his memorandum within 48 hours, however. Come what may, he said, German troops would occupy the Sudetenland on the 1st of October. Hitler's rage continued into the evening when he made a speech at the Sportspalast. His ire was especially reserved for Beneš. Quote, "It is not so much a question of Czechoslovakia, it is a question of Herr Beneš," end quote, before explaining that it was he who set about the genocide of the German minorities, and it was him who was putting his country at the feet of the communists. Quote, "He now holds the decision in his hand, peace or war. Either he will now accept this offer and at last give Germans their freedom, or we will take this freedom for ourselves. We are determined. Let Herr Beneš choose," end quote. When Hitler finished, Goebbels blurted out, quote, "One thing is for sure, 1918 will never be repeated," end quote. Europe did not take this speech well. Air raid posters were planted up in London, and trenches were dug near Buckingham Palace. The American ambassador called Washington and said, quote, "I believe the chances are about 95 in 100 of war, beginning midnight Friday," end quote. According to William Shirer at this time, the German public was not in a mood for war. In fact, they weren't all hyped up about it at all like the Czechs or the French government. The German people seemed to place all their faith at Hitler's feet. Somehow he would get them through the crisis successfully. After all, he hadn't failed them so far. Essentially, at this point, this was the situation. The two sides agreed that the Czechs needed to clear out of the Sudetenland. The only issue was the timing. To the Brits, going too fast could provoke a bigger crisis. But to Hitler, going too slow meant more and more dead Germans as the days went by. After all, there was a seemingly endless massacre of Germans going on just across his border. The British and the French, in his eyes, were preventing him from saving his own people, which he could easily do. Chamberlain did not give in, however, and he fired off an appeal to Hitler via a statement in the press, and his envoy, Sir Horace Wilson, was back in the Reich Chancellery to discuss things with Hitler. Not much came of it, but Wilson did promise, quote, "I will still try to make those Czechs sensible," end quote. "I would welcome that," Hitler said, and continued on to say that England could wish for no better friend than Hitler. Back in England, Chamberlain was about to address the nation. Just before he walked up to the microphone, he was absolutely riddled with doubts, an issue that would plague the next 2 years of his career. "I am wobbling all over the place," he said. At that exact moment, the British Navy was mobilised. Then he stepped up to speak, quote, "How horrible, how fantastic, how incredible it is that we should be trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. It seems all the more impossible that a quarrel which has already been settled in principle should be the subject of war. I am myself a man of peace to the depths of my soul. Armed conflict between nations is a nightmare to me, but if I were convinced that any nation had made up its mind to dominate the world by force, I should feel that it must be resisted. Under such a domination, life for people who believe in liberty would not be worth living, but war is a fearful thing, and we must be very clear, before we embark on it, that it is really the great issues that are at stake," end quote. This could hardly fill the British people with confidence, and it was clear that the moves were actually out of Chamberlain's control, or at least partly. Chamberlain was dead set on peace. He genuinely hated the idea of war with Germany. But the British state, the machine behind the man, the men in the shadows, were pushing even more towards war. Chamberlain could only do so much to prevent it. 2 hours later, a letter from Hitler arrived. It began with a rant against the Czechs, but continued on to say that Chamberlain should continue his efforts to, quote, "bring the government in Prague to reason at the very last hour," end quote. Chamberlain quickly wrote out a reply, quote, "I feel convinced that we could reach an agreement in a week. I cannot believe that you will take the responsibility of starting a world war, which may end civilization, for the sake of a few days' delay in settling this long-standing problem," end quote. He then fired off a letter to Mussolini too, quote, "I trust your excellency will inform the German Chancellor that you are willing to be represented and urge him to agree to my proposal, which will keep all our peoples out of war," end quote. He then stayed up till long after midnight, preparing a speech for Parliament the next day. The same day, Hitler's ultimatum would expire. The world woke up on the 28th of September 1938, expecting war. Today was the day. Everybody feared the worst, or, in the warmongers' case, the best. But ultimately, the majority of Europeans did not want to start killing each other. At 8 AM, the French ambassador requested an audience with Hitler to present a new suggestion. He was told by Ribbentrop that Hitler was not receiving ambassadors. Just after 10 a.m, British Ambassador Henderson called Goering to tell him that both him and his French colleague were being denied access to the Führer by Ribbentrop. Goering, who genuinely wanted to avoid war, said, quote, "You need not say a word more. I am immediately going to the Führer," end quote. The Chancellery was in absolute chaos when Goering arrived. Generals were everywhere, followed by their staff. Everyone was rushing around, trying to consult Hitler or others. Hitler himself had gone off to his winter garden for privacy. Goering grabbed former Foreign Minister Neurath to join him, and they went in. Neurath said, quote, "Mein Führer, do you wish to start a war under any circumstances? Of course not," end quote. Ribbentrop was hovering outside, and then suddenly Goering stormed out screaming, quote, "Herr von Ribbentrop, if war should break out, I will be the first one to tell the German people that you pushed things to this end," end quote. The two then began berating each other in front of everyone. Ribbentrop said that Goering feared combat, to which Goering responded that he would be in the leading aeroplane the second Hitler said march, on the condition that Ribbentrop joined him. At 11 a.m, François Poncet, the French ambassador, was finally allowed in, and Ribbentrop joined them. The Frenchman laid out a map on the table and said, quote, "You are naturally confident of winning the war, just as we believe that we can defeat you, but why should you take the risk when your essential demands can be met without war," end quote. Hitler had no response to this logic, and it appeared things were tilting towards peace, even at this late hour when Hitler seemed genuinely decided on war. Suddenly, a messenger burst in and said that Ambassador Attalico had an urgent message from Rome. It was the Duce with an urgent message. The ambassador, who was completely out of breath from sprinting over, said, quote, "Il Duce informs you that, whatever you decide, Führer, fascist Italy stands beside you." Il Duce is, however, of the opinion that it would be wise to accept the British proposal and begs you to refrain from mobilization, end quote. Hitler replied, quote, "Tell Il Duce I accept his proposal," end quote. The meeting with the Frenchman then carried on, but Hitler didn't reveal that he had accepted Mussolini's proposal. When asked for a solid reply, Hitler just told the Frenchman that he would have an official response early that afternoon. Eventually, over the next few hours, a general plan began to emerge. Hitler would delay the mobilization as suggested by Mussolini, and then he and Chamberlain would meet again, this time with Mussolini and Daladier as well in Munich. Chamberlain's invitation arrived as he was addressing the House of Commons. He was just talking about Hitler delaying the mobilization, and then he was given a slip of paper. His face instantly transformed, quote, "That is not all. I have something further to say to the House yet. I have now been informed by Herr Hitler that he invites me to meet him at Munich tomorrow morning. He has also invited Signor Mussolini and Monsieur Daladier," end quote. An unidentified member of the House shouted out, "Thank God for the Prime Minister," and then a hysterical applause erupted from the crowd. The usually restrained Queen Mary, who happened to be in the audience, burst into unstoppable tears of joy. Sir John Simon recalled, quote, "From all sides there was impetuous cheering, in which few failed to join, and we adjourned almost at once by common consent. I saw men, some of whom have since spoken slightingly of what Chamberlain was trying to do, cross the floor in tears and with unrestrained emotion grasp him by the hand," end quote. One of the only men in the room who wasn't impressed was Winston Churchill. He was heard to say, quote, "And what about Czechoslovakia? Does no one think of asking their opinion?" end quote. As we know now, however, Churchill was wrapped up in a scheme with the Czech government and the Focus, worth millions of pounds to provoke a war with Germany. So understandably, he would have been rather angry, as his paymasters could simply turn the tap off if war did not come. Churchill was in a minority in this moment, however. The only ones not celebrating were those being paid, or those hell-bent on war for their own personal reasons. One of these men was Benez himself, the man who had set off the crisis. He sent off a plea to Chamberlain, quote, "I ask Mr. Chamberlain very earnestly for help, because it is our desire to contribute to peace. I beg, therefore, that nothing may be done in Munich without Czechoslovakia being heard," end quote. This was coming from the man who was currently wrapped up in a scheme to try and take Chamberlain down. Another group that was dismayed was the anti-Hitler group. This group, entirely made up of the old nobility who missed their privileged days under the Kaiser, had now lost their pretext to take down Hitler. It was over for them. Elsewhere, everyone else celebrated. In Paris, London, New York, and capitals all over the Western world, there was crowds in the streets shouting for joy. A generation had been saved from war thanks to Chamberlain, Adolf Hitler, and Mussolini. At 6 p.m, Mussolini's train left Rome to the sounds of roaring cheers. Not only did he now appear to be the saviour of peace across the globe, but he had won Hitler's gratitude for supporting him throughout the crisis. Many of Hitler's doubts about his ally must have suddenly disappeared overnight. In return, Hitler would never let Mussolini down. On the morning of the 29th, Hitler met Mussolini between Munich and the border. Hitler proceeded to get Mussolini up to speed on the recent developments. Meanwhile, Chamberlain and Daladier were on their way by plane. Before setting off, Chamberlain said to journalists, quote,
"If at first you don't succeed, try again." That's what I'm doing. When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this nettle danger, we pluck this flower safety.
Daladier touched down at 11:15 a.m., expecting to be detested by the Germans. Instead, he was greeted with cheers and given a hero's welcome. Chamberlain too was greeted even more heroically, although he was only in public for a few minutes before being whizzed off to the Führerbau for the conference. He was the first to arrive with his two colleagues. Eventually, Hitler arrived last, and the four men sat down with their aides at a buffet table. Everyone greeted each other warmly, but all were a little cold and sceptical of each other at first. Hitler did his best to keep things talkative, but most of his guests didn't speak German, so this was rather difficult. When the buffet was over, Hitler led the relevant men into a large rectangular room overlooking the Königsplatz. Here, they got down to business. There was no plan. The conference was terribly organised and arranged with very little notice. Regardless, everyone was here, and that was what counted. Different conversations began to arise between the different men, and no one really knew how to proceed. It was literally four men locked in a room, with the task of saving Europe from the brink of war, somehow. Eventually, Mussolini attempted to put some order into the proceedings, and he had put a written proposal down on the table, which he passed off as his own. The reality was, however, that the Germans had written it. By this time, however, it was 3 p.m, and it was time for lunch. After lunch, things were even more confused. Schmidt, the translator, was having an absolute nightmare, as he attempted to translate often 3 or 4 people talking at once. Things got even more hectic as others began to randomly invade the room. Goering, Henderson, the French and Italian foreign ministers, all sorts of men began to wander in with secretaries and adjutants. Everyone crowded around the floor to see what was going on, and in the end there was a strange semicircle forming of everyone. Of this strange group, Mussolini, who had acted as if he were the host the whole time, stepped up to take command. Mussolini could speak French, English, German, and obviously Italian. However, the other 3 could only speak their native language. He would ask Hitler something, get an answer, and then give an easy-to-understand summary, but not the exact wording to the English and the French. He would later recall, quote, "That was my great day. All eyes were on me, not on Mr. Daladier or Mr. Chamberlain. It was an occasion worthy of the Caesars. Do you remember?" End quote. By 8 p.m, agreement seemed imminent, however there was still plenty of finer details to clarify. Hitler, who had prepared a banquet to conclude the conference, was getting impatient, and suggested that they all go and eat, as the food was getting cold. The Brits and the French declined. Schmidt felt it was because they were in no mood, quote, "They had secured peace, but at the price of a serious loss of prestige," end quote. The Brits and the French then hurried off to their hotel rooms, where their food was then sent. The Germans and the Italians, however, remained at the Führerbau and began to celebrate with champagne. At 10 p.m, everyone was then back at the Führerbau and seated. Then, there followed 2 tedious hours of delay and redrafting, but eventually an agreement was reached. Goering recalled later, quote, "Actually, the whole thing was a cut-and-dried affair. Neither Chamberlain nor Daladier was the least bit interested in sacrificing or risking anything to save Czechoslovakia. That was clear as day to me. The fate of Czechoslovakia was essentially sealed in 3 hours. Then they argued for hours more about the word guarantee. Chamberlain kept hedging. Daladier hardly paid any attention at all. He just sat there like this." Goering slumped down and showed a bored expression. All he did was nod approval from time to time. Not the slightest objection to anything. I was simply amazed at how easily the thing was managed by Hitler. After all, they knew that Skoda, etc. had munitions plants in the Sudetenland, and that Czechoslovakia would be at our mercy. When he suggested that certain armaments which were across the Sudeten border should be brought into the Sudeten territory as soon as we take it over, I thought there would be an explosion. But no, not a peep. We got everything we wanted, just like that. End quote. At 1:30 a.m, the finished document was placed on a table in front of all the participants for them to sign. The new plan was a 4-stage evacuation of the Sudetenland to begin on the 1st of October. After this, an international commission would determine which districts would hold plebiscites to make a final decision on the borders. The Führer was the first to sign, and he appeared genuinely happy. Then, when all had signed, they said their goodbyes, and Hitler was the first to leave. William Shirer reported that there was a, quote, light of victory in Hitler's eyes as he strutted down the broad steps, end quote. At 2:15 a.m., the Czech representatives, who had never been consulted, were called into Chamberlain's room. The Prime Minister made a speech before telling them their terms, and as Daladier was handing over a copy of the agreement, he began to yawn. One of the Czechs began to cry. The crisis, started by the Czechs, had ended in tears all around. Beneš and his representatives cried tears of sadness. They knew they had brought about the end of their country with their gamble. The outside world, however, cried tears of joy. In fact, as the Czech representative was crying his eyes out in Chamberlain's room, the crowd outside was roaring with cheers, begging to see the peacemakers so they could thank them personally. After endless songs and calls for "Dear little Daladier," the Frenchman appeared on the balcony to the crowd's delight. Later in the morning, Chamberlain was given an ovation by the Müncheners as he was driven in an open-top car to Hitler's apartment for a final, informal talk before he left. He had brought with him a document that went far beyond the one agreed on the Sudetenland. This was more of a general agreement to understand each other and to use diplomatic means in future, so no crisis like this would ever arise again. It was a way of Chamberlain putting the responsibility on Hitler for any future crisis. He could now say, look, I tried. At breakfast, he said to one of his party, quote, if he signs it and sticks to it, that will be fine. But if he breaks it, that will convince the Americans of the kind of man he is, end quote. In a way, the fact that Chamberlain would say this is one of the most important quotes of the entire crisis. It showed British policy at the time. They were simply too weak to stand up to Hitler. They just needed the Americans on side. But Roosevelt, who truly wanted war more than any other man in the world, perhaps except for Churchill, was having a hard time convincing his isolationist-minded citizens. If Britain were to go to war, she would need American help. In 1938, this wasn't on the cards. The following year, however, it would be, and Roosevelt would directly involve himself repetitively. It wouldn't be until a very convenient event in 1941, however, that Roosevelt and Churchill's dreams would come true. For now, though, the document was shown to Hitler, who immediately exclaimed, "Ja, ja," before attaching his signature to it. At 5:38 p.m., Chamberlain touched down in England to the roaring cheers of the British public. He stood in the open doorway, waving the document he and Hitler had signed earlier that day. I've got it, he shouted to Halifax. Chamberlain was then given a letter from the king, asking him to, quote, come straight to Buckingham Palace, so that I may express to you personally my heartfelt congratulations on the success of your visit to Munich, end quote. In the pouring rain, he then read out the entirety of the agreement he and Hitler had come to that morning. Quote, we, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognising that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for our two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. We are resolved that the methods of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference, and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe, end quote. The absolutely overjoyed crowd then shouted out, "Three cheers for Chamberlain! Hip hip, hooray!" and he was off on his way to Buckingham Palace.
And thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe.
From Heston, a triumphal progress as Mr. Chamberlain drives to report immediately to His Majesty the King at Buckingham Palace. And in this, perhaps the most historic spot of the Empire's capital, let the people themselves speak what is in their hearts.
The trip was only 9 miles, but due to the sheer size of the crowds, the journey took an hour and a half. Chamberlain wrote, quote, even the descriptions of the papers give no idea of the scenes in the streets as I drove from Heston to the palace. They were lined from one end to the other with people of every class, shouting themselves hoarse, leaping on the running board, banging on the windows, and thrusting their hands into the car to be shaken, end quote. When he arrived at the palace, Chamberlain was invited to, quote, join the king on the balcony as a token of the lasting gratitude of his fellow countrymen throughout the empire, end quote. Chamberlain accepted. This was the first time that a monarch had allowed a commoner to be seen on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and here he was, greeted as if he was the saviour of the world, which indeed he was. The procession continued, and he was then off to 10 Downing Street, where another crowd awaited him who sang, "For he's a jolly good fellow," over and over and over again. Then from the window he made one of the most famous short speeches of all time, quote, my good friends, this is the second time in our history that there has come back from Germany to Downing Street, peace with honour. I believe it is peace for our time, end quote. Over in France, Daladier returned home expecting to be stoned for having capitulated to Hitler. When he saw a gigantic crowd there awaiting him, he feared the worst and asked the pilot to circle the airfield twice before gaining the courage to go in. When he landed, instead of being stoned, he was welcomed as a hero of peace, the saviour of Europe alongside Chamberlain. The French people had been saved from another pointless war with their eastern neighbour over Eastern European affairs. The following morning, the London Times wrote, quote, "No conqueror in history ever came home from a battlefield with nobler laurels." The widow of Prime Minister Asquith, the man who had led Britain into the Great War, called Chamberlain the greatest Englishman who had ever lived. The Kaiser wrote to Queen Mary, stating that he was overjoyed that a catastrophe had been averted, and he said that Chamberlain had been personally inspired by heaven and guided by God himself. Back at home, the Church quite agreed with him. Quote, "The Church of England responded very largely, as if the men of Munich had been guided by Almighty God. You have been enabled to do a great thing, in a great way, at a time of almost unexampled crisis. I thank God for it," wrote the Archbishop of Canterbury to Chamberlain. There were services of thanksgiving in all the churches and cathedrals of England on the next Sunday. In Lincoln Cathedral, the Dean held the congregation spellbound by ascribing the turn of events to God's wonderful providence. End quote. Once more, the only angry men were Churchill and those on the payroll of his masters. Duff Cooper immediately resigned as First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill sarcastically said at the celebrations, quote, "I never knew Neville was born in Bethlehem," which, like Roosevelt before him, was another atheistic snipe at the extremely religious Chamberlain. A few days later, Churchill would speak in the House, quote, "We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat." Cries of "nonsense" rang out in return. Regardless, he carried on, quote, "All is over, silent, mournful, abandoned, broken Czechoslovakia recedes into darkness. We have passed an awful milestone in our history, when the whole equilibrium of Europe has been deranged and the terrible words have for the time being been pronounced against the Western democracies. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year unless, by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigour, we rise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden times." End quote. Churchill, as always, was a great actor. He was willing to send another generation of young men to die in France so that he could get his paycheck from his shadowy masters. Nothing would stand in the way of him and his money. In private, Churchill would rage impotently at Hitler's success. Meanwhile in Germany, Hitler was relieved. He didn't want war with the West, but he did actually want a war with Czechoslovakia. He genuinely admired Chamberlain and saw him as a good man, but he would in private often rage at his interference. The Czechs had brutalised Germans for 2 decades, and now Hitler wanted nothing more than to smash into their nation and drive through Prague as the conqueror. The French and the British had robbed him of that, and for that, he was angry. But as for avoiding a general European war, he was overjoyed. It was a time of mixed emotions, but most of all, he was just happy that the pain was finally over. The Sudeten Germans were coming home. In Prague, the new Prime Minister said that they had been forced to accept the Munich Agreement. He said it was a choice, quote, "between a reduction of our territory and the death of the nation," end quote. The reality was, however, that Beneš, who had now run away into exile in London, after almost plunging Europe into a war that would have meant the deaths of millions, had opened Pandora's box. His gamble had lost the Sudetenland to Germany. Now they would lose everything. The Hungarians, still extremely bitter from the way they'd been mistreated at the end of the Great War, were ready and waiting to pounce. Just a month later, they too would come knocking, demanding their countrymen be returned to them. The Slovaks, too, finally sensed their chance to gain their freedom. Czechoslovakia, or what was left of it, immediately began to crumble. In Italy, Mussolini was greeted with the greatest celebration that he had personally seen in the entire 20 years of fascism. He was greeted as if he was Caesar himself. Wherever he went, there were chants of "Duce, Duce, Duce." A few days after Chamberlain's roaring success, he was getting worried about the warmongers like Churchill and their effect on public opinion. He was quite correct. A year later, they would drag him down with them. For now, however, he wrote to Hitler asking him if he could, quote, "give the Prime Minister some support in forming public opinion in Britain," end quote. Hitler agreed, and that evening he made a blistering attack against the warmongers at the Sportpalast. This wasn't necessary, however, and for now, Chamberlain was overthinking. The next day, October 6th, Chamberlain's policy was approved by a vote of 366 to 144. Cooper, Eden, and Churchill, the three being paid, or allegedly, in Eden's case, abstained in protest. Every word that came out of the mouths of these three warmongers against Chamberlain were taken as a personal attack back in Berlin by Hitler. No matter what happened, it seemed, the warmonger problem would just not go away. Somehow, they were managing to turn this roaring success of Germans returning to Germany into some kind of calamity. Immediately, Churchill set about spinning events as some kind of prelude to a great war, the false view that persists to this day. Over time, this idea would infect more and more people, and eventually it would make war inevitable, much to the Germans' confusion. Churchill, for his part, would die a very rich and very revered man, happy that the truth of why he supported such a policy was hidden from the British public, who then, and now, love him so much. Again, on the 9th of October in Saarbrücken, Hitler would make a speech raging against the free warmongers, as well as thanking what could now be called his best friend outside of Germany, Benito Mussolini. Quote, "We are all so happy no blood was shed over this, despite the hopes of so many international agitators and profiteers. If I mention the help of the rest of the world in bringing about this peaceful solution, I must again and again place at the head of it our only real friend whom we possess today, Benito Mussolini." He then carried on, quote, "I know, and I know that you know, what we owe this man. I would like also to mention 2 other statesmen who tried hard to find a way to peace, and who together with the great Italian and us have concluded an agreement that secured justice for 10 million Germans and peace for the world. I am happy these millions of Germans are free, that they belong to us, and that peace has been secured." Nevertheless, the experiences, especially of the last 8 months, must strengthen our resolve to be careful and never to leave anything undone that must be done for the protection of the Reich. Opposite us are statesmen who, that we must believe of them, also want peace. However, they govern in countries whose internal construction makes it possible for them at any time to be supplanted by others who do not aim at peace. These others are there. In England, it merely is necessary that instead of Chamberlain, a Duff Cooper or an Eden or a Churchill come into power. We know that the aim of these men would be to start a war. They do not attempt to hide it. That obligates us to be on the watch to think of the protection of the Reich. We know further that now, as before, there is lurking threateningly that international world enemy who has found a living expression in Bolshevism. We also know the power of the international press that lives solely on lies and calumniation. In view of this peculiarity of the world about us and of these forces, we must be careful about the future. We must at all times have a will for peace and be ready for defence." End quote. And so, in early October, Hitler entered the Sudetenland, where he was greeted much the same way as he was in Austria. He was swarmed, kissed, touched and given flowers. Crowds stretched for miles welcoming the Führer who had quite literally saved their lives. Until now, they were being massacred by the thousand. For the price of the Sudeten German self-determination, however, Europe had walked right to the brink of war. At times, it was only hours away. But thanks almost entirely to Neville Chamberlain's endless attempts at peace, Europe was spared that fate. Chamberlain has gone down in history as a clown, a naive man trying to stop Hitler invading the world. This narrative, however, was quite literally written by the victors. Churchill himself, who detested the religious Chamberlain and his morals, would paint this narrative in his books post-war. In a way, the entire British history of these 2 men is a lie. The truth is that Neville Chamberlain was a hero, and without a doubt one of the greatest men of his era. I hope I've been able to give you a better insight into the true nature of this man in this video, by simply just recounting what happened. Chamberlain truly cared. He didn't want another generation of men to die needlessly for a cause that had nothing to do with the British or her empire. Despite making himself unpopular at times, he would pursue this task doggedly, even though he often had self-doubts. Whilst Chamberlain has been ridiculed for his efforts, that isn't his fault. It's the fault of those who painted the post-war picture. Chamberlain in the afterlife can rightly hold his head up high as a man who did the right, moral and Christian thing. He is one of the greatest men of recent history and cannot be applauded enough. He was a moral man amongst a sea of thieves, snobs and warmongers with personal agendas in the British Parliament. There simply is not men like him in parliamentary politics anymore. Hitler, on the other hand, was going through it. During this entire crisis, he was worried he was approaching death's door. He was incredibly sick and would often talk of not being able to see the fruits of his hard work. In a way, this explains why he was so hasty to get the Sudeten crisis solved. He worried that his successors would not have the will to deal with such problems. Hitler's behaviour was by no means perfect during this whole crisis. Chamberlain was trying his best, but Hitler continued to make life difficult for him. He gave Hitler everything he wanted, but Hitler still worried over the timing. Whilst this is understandable due to the massacres of Germans just over his border, the whole thing ended up getting delayed anyway, so he didn't gain anything by messing Chamberlain around on the PM's second visit. But in such emotional moments, it's not as simple as that. In the end, he got what he wanted, despite many Sudeten Germans sadly having to pay the price. This wouldn't be the end, however. Czechoslovakia began to disintegrate, and the Germans still remaining deeper into the Czech interior were treated horrendously as the Czechs took out their fury over this whole situation on them. At the same time as the Germans took the Sudetenland, the Poles took advantage and seized Sudeten. The Hungarians and the Slovakians began to agitate, and soon enough, the state imploded. But that is a story for another time. For now, the Sudetens could come home. With them came 743,000 Czechs who lived in the region too. Hitler wanted to calm the situation down and certainly didn't want a repeat of the previous tension, so he granted German citizenship on request to men over the age of 28 as well as their families and children. 260,000 Czech soldiers and civil servants were forced home by the Czech government, and 160,000 voluntarily went home to the Czech state. All of these were allowed to keep their private property with the option to sell or rent it. Out of 300,000 remaining in German territory, only 140 were deported as undesirable persons. All was not well, however. One man above all was trying to blow every situation out of proportion, and that, as usual, was Winston Churchill. For the next year, he would poison the well of peace. He would go to any measure to secure his paycheck. For years, Churchill had been the most outspoken advocate against the Soviets. Now, because his paymasters wanted him to, he began to say that the Brits should find common cause with Stalin's Soviet Union in order to take down Hitler. To many, Churchill appeared utterly insane, but as tension rose in Europe, he gained more and more influence. In 1939, Neville Chamberlain, dying of cancer, would not be as steadfast as he had been a year earlier, and would allow himself to be walked all over by Churchill, among others. Europe would not survive a second crisis as a result. Chamberlain did not keep his head. Of all the men involved in this particular crisis, however, Beneš is of course the most at fault. Beneš himself took the gamble. In fact, he would later say, quote, "We needed a war, and I did everything to bring the war on," end quote. He truly tried his best. Thousands of Sudeten men, women and children were slaughtered simply for being German, entirely due to him. He was key in the intrigues around Europe to topple the Chamberlain and Daladier governments, so the shadowy figures behind the scenes in these nations could install their warmongering puppets like Churchill. He, above all, had a brutal bloodlust to massacre the German people. For his efforts, his country disintegrated. When he returned home after the war, he had the Sudeten Germans completely genocided. In 1948, Beneš would be the victim of intriguing, the method he loved so much. He was overthrown by the communists and died that same year, bitter and depressed. When the Iron Curtain fell, his Czechoslovak state gave way to Czechia and Slovakia. Only one of his wishes was ever accomplished. The Czechs kept the Sudetenland, and the Germans there, mostly women and children, were genocided by the hundreds of thousands. Thank you very much for watching. The Sudeten crisis has been rather forgotten and just glossed over as if it was simply another step on the path to Hitler's world domination, but as I've showed in this video, it was nothing of the sort, and was its own unique event that could have gone very differently. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then please do consider leaving a like, a comment, or even sharing the video, which helps more than anything. As always, the biggest thanks of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribe Star, and YouTube members who keep this channel afloat. I am able to do this for a living, entirely thanks to kind subscriptions due to the videos not being monetized initially, and needing to wait for a manual review. I cannot thank you all enough. So if you enjoy the videos, want to join the Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or our Minecraft server, then please do consider clicking the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can possibly imagine. Thank you very much. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Gaius Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksacker Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Mr. Gaming, Cameron, Slugwig 1919, Gloomy, Troy Harser, Jagdkampf, Rowan, Swedish Chef, Honda, Mirko, David Byers, Max Anton, Gragas, Conqueror, It's Okay to be a Nationalist, Inflection Point, Vet Exempt, Automat 762X39, Monsieur Mercier, The Waller, Suma Klubayek, Jorgen 1997, and Admiral Kempinski.